All right, next up we're going to talk about the ovarian cycle. So an oocyte is what's also known as an immature egg. This is going to be contained within a follicle. Females are born with around 2 million follicles, but only have about 300,000 to 400,000 by the time they hit puberty. Only about 400 are ever going to mature. A female produces only 1 egg per month during their reproductive years. And as the follicle matures during the ovarian cycle, it's going to change from a primary to a secondary to a vesicular or Graphinian follicle. Now, a primary follicle, or in the case of a primary follicle, epithelial cells are going to surround a primary oocyte. In a secondary follicle, the follicular fluid is going to surround the secondary oocyte. In a vesicular follicle, the fluid-filled cavity is going to enlarge to the point that the follicle wall balloons out around the surface of the ovary. So there are a couple of really important steps in oogenesis. Oogenesis is just the production of an oocyte. The primary oocyte is going to undergo meiosis I, which is going to result in 2 cells that are haploid. One of these cells is what we refer to as a polar body. Its function is simply to hold the discarded chromosomes. So in the case of spermatogenesis, we start off with a single primary spermatocyte. At the end of spermatogenesis, we have 4 genetically unique sperm cells. In the case of oogenesis, we're going to start off with 1 primary oocyte, and we are going to end up with only 1 mature ovum or egg. And this is due to the production of those polar bodies. And I know I'm mentioning them very briefly now, and you don't have anything on the slide about them, and that's because we will talk about polar bodies, we will talk about meiosis, and spermatogenesis and oogenesis quite a bit in a later chapter. So I'm just familiarizing you with the content now. All right, so the secondary oocyte is going to undergo meiosis too, but only if it is first fertilized by a sperm cell. If the cell remains unfertilized, it's never actually going to complete the process of meiosis, and it's going to die shortly after being released from the ovary. In the case of ovulation, the vesicular follicle is going to burst, releasing that oocyte. The vesicular follicle is then going to develop into a corpus luteum, which is a gland-like structure. If the egg is not fertilized, the corpus luteum is going to disintegrate. A primary follicle is going to produce estrogen. A secondary follicle is going to produce estrogen and some progesterone. That corpus luteum is responsible for producing progesterone primarily and some small amounts of estrogen. So here is a diagram of the ovarian cycle. We start off with a primary follicle followed by a secondary follicle. That secondary follicle is going to eventually mature and develop into that vesicular follicle, which will eventually burst. When it bursts, it's going to release a secondary oocyte, which can then undergo the process of fertilization. Here we have our primary oocyte will undergo meiosis I to form a secondary oocyte. If that secondary oocyte is fertilized, it will finish out the process of meiosis II to form a zygote. So, like I said, there are quite a few steps in oogenesis. That primary oocyte is going to undergo meiosis I. Secondary oocyte will undergo meiosis II if it reaches fertilization. Like I said, we'll talk about oogenesis quite a bit in a later chapter, so I just kind of want to familiarize you with the concepts so that way you recognize it when you see it again. So those phases of the ovarian cycle is going to be ultimately controlled by the hypothalamus. Just like in males, the hypothalamus is going to be responsible for secreting that gonadotropic releasing hormone. That gonadotropic releasing hormone is going to stimulate the anterior pituitary to produce follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormones. Those hormones are going to be responsible for controlling that ovarian and uterine cycles. So here we have our ovarian and our uterine cycles. The ovarian cycle is going to, well, I'll start off with some of the different hormones. So the follicular phase is going to be the first half of the ovarian cycle. So that's right here when we are developing that follicle. The follicle-stimulating hormone is going to promote the development of those primary follicles, which are going to primarily secrete estrogen. As estrogen rises, so here we have our follicle-stimulating hormone and our luteinizing hormone. Those are going to be responsible for producing those follicles. Those follicles are then going to release estrogen and progesterone. So starting off early on, we have low levels of estrogen, but as we progress through that follicular phase, we're going to see those estrogen levels start to rise. As estrogen rises, it's going to exert a negative feedback control over the anterior pituitary secretion of follicle-stimulating hormone, which is going to bring about the end of the follicular phase. That surge of luteinizing hormone is going to be released from the anterior pituitary, which triggers ovulation on day 14, so this region right around here, on day 14 of a 28-day cycle. The luteal phase, that'll be this region over here, is going to promote the development of the corpus luteum, which is going to secrete high levels of progesterone and some levels of estrogen. So this is where we're going to see progesterone really start to spike. If pregnancy does not occur, it's going to regress. We're going to see a new cycle start to begin. In the event, or a homeostatic imbalance, sort of, it's hard to call it an imbalance when everyone goes through it, but it is a change to this ovarian and uterine cycles, would be menopause. Menopause occurs when the ovarian cycle ceases, usually between the ages of 45 and 55. During this time, the ovaries will no longer respond to the gonadotrophic hormones, and they're not going to secrete that estrogen or progesterone. At the onset of menopause, menstruation typically becomes pretty irregular, but menopause isn't said to be complete until menstruation has been completely absent for about a year. Estrogen and progesterone, these are going to be responsible for those secondary sex characteristics. Axillary and pubic hair, greater fat accumulation under the skin. We're also going to see both of those are going to be required for the development of breast tissue. There are a couple of other hormones that are associated with the female reproductive system. Prolactin, which is involved in milk production after pregnancy. And oxytocin, which isn't involved in milk production, but is responsible for inducing milk letdown when the baby begins to nurse. The pelvic girdle in females tends to be wider and deeper, so the pelvic cavity is going to be larger. Females tend to have wider hips than males, and their thigh coverage, their thighs converge at a greater angle towards the knees. The female pelvis also tilts forward, so females tend to have more of a lower back curve than males, and they tend to also have a protruding buttocks because of the tilt of that pelvis. All right, so we've talked about the ovarian cycle. Now we're going to mention the uterine cycle. The uterine cycle is going to be a cyclical series of events caused by estrogen and progesterone. This is also going to be a 28-day cycle that's going to be divided into a couple of key characteristics. Days 1 through 5 are going to be the menstruation phase. This occurs during this time we have extremely low levels of estrogen and progesterone, which causes the endometrium to disintegrate and its blood vessels to rupture. This results in menses. Menses is going to be the flow of blood and tissues out of the vagina. During days 6 to 13, we have the proliferation phase. This is an increased production of estrogen by a new follicle. This is going to cause the endometrium to thicken and become glandular. On day 14, ovulation will occur. Days 15 to 28 is what's known as the secretory phase. This is going to be an increased production of progesterone by the corpus luteum, which is going to cause that endometrium to thicken. This also causes the uterine gland to mature and produce a thick secretion. The endometrium would now be prepared to receive the developing embryo. If it does not occur, so if the individual is not pregnant, the corpus luteum is going to regress. This is going to result in a low level of progesterone, which then causes the menstruation. So here is a wonderful little diagram that is going to kind of outlay the events of the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle and the main things that occur and the types of hormones that are going to be present in controlling each of those stages. All right, so that's everything for a non-pregnant female. In the case of pregnancy, we are going to see a slightly different series of events. So only one sperm is going to be needed to fertilize an egg. Once the egg is fertilized, it forms a cell that we refer to as a zygote. This is a fully diploid individual cell. As the zygote travels down the uterine tube to the uterus, it begins the process of mitosis. This mitosis is, if you remember from early on, what is mitosis primarily responsible for? We have mitosis and meiosis. One is going to be responsible for growth and repair. One is going to be responsible for reproduction. So which one is occurring, or what is going on during this mitosis phase? So during mitosis, that cell is going to be dividing and replicating. Once it is made of many cells, it is called an embryo. So at the single cell stage, it's referred to as a zygote. Once we have multiple cells, we have an embryo. The endometrium is now going to be prepared to receive the developing embryo. If that embryo is developing as it should, it's going to implant in the endometrial lining several days following fertilization. Implantation is going to signal the beginning of the pregnancy. An abortion may be spontaneous, referred to as a miscarriage, or induced. Both of these are going to end with the loss of the embryo or fetus. So a placenta is going to form to start sustaining that developing embryo. It's going to originate from both maternal and fetal tissues. This is going to be where the exchange between the fetal and maternal blood occurs. This is going to be responsible for producing human chorionic gonadotropin, or that HCG. This is going to help maintain the corpus luteum. So when you're taking a pregnancy test, what the pregnancy test is looking for is detecting that HCG in the blood or urine. Rising amounts of HCG are going to stimulate that corpus luteum to produce increasing amounts of progesterone. Now that progesterone is going to be responsible for shutting down the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, so no new follicles begin to develop. The progesterone is also going to maintain the uterine lining where the embryo now resides, preventing menstruation from occurring. Eventually, the placenta is going to produce progesterone and some estrogen on its own. So the corpus luteum will no longer be needed, and it will eventually regress. So here is what those ovarian and uterine cycles look like in a pregnant individual. Birth control pills to prevent pregnancy usually involve taking active pills, mean that they contain estrogen and progesterone for 21 days, and then inactive pills or sugar pills that do not contain those hormones for 7 days. The uterine lining will build up while the active pills are being taken, and then progesterone will decrease after the last active pills are taken, causing that menstruation to occur. All right, so you should be able to summarize the roles of estrogen and progesterone in the ovarian and uterine cycles, describe the changes that occur in the ovarian and uterine cycles during pregnancy, and describe the changes that occur in the ovarian and uterine cycles when birth control pills are used. All right, please let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns.